he's like forgiving. Like he understands this person's perspective, which is essentially what I feel Kendrick has been trying to get across throughout this whole track. A couple of days ago, Kendrick Lamar released the first solo track that he's put out in 5 years with The Heart Part 5. And if you're familiar with Kendrick, you're probably also familiar with the Heart series. It's essentially a track that he'll release just before an album's released. And it's not necessarily meant to be any indication of what the album is going to sound like or what the subject matter is going to be. I always think of it more of just him getting his thoughts off, whether this is before the album is completed or just before it's coming out, just all these remaining thoughts that he has. That's up for debate, but I always treat the Heart series as its own thing separate from the album. But this time, because it's been so long, maybe things will change, especially because this time there's a video to it, which there's a whole lot to look at with that as well. So let's get into it. Before I get too far, this is not going to be a full breakdown. This is just going to be some thoughts about the concepts and the things that he's said. Because if I did a full breakdown, we'd be here for hours. Also, like I mentioned, this song has a video aspect to it, which is different. But by now, everyone has seen the video, or at least seen screen grabs. So we know that in the video, he uses deepfake technology to emulate or take on the persona of multiple prominent figures in the Black community, all who have some level of controversy to them. So he has OJ, Kanye, Jussie Smollett, Will Smith, Kobe, and Nipsey Hussle. Everyone who's been, a pretty big deal in recent memory. But then also OJ's way back. Now, the reason I think that he chose to do the video like this, well, and also just to do the video, is to really drive that idea forward. Like, he's taking on these personas of different people, but it doesn't even necessarily have to be these individuals. It could be just anyone. Like, that's kind of the point, I feel. In the video, it starts off with him saying, "I am all of us, Oklahoma," which obviously, now that we've seen the video, makes sense because he's taking on all these faces. But you could take it a step further with the first lines that he says: "As I get a little older, I realize life is perspective, and my perspective may differ from yours." So by him saying this, you can kind of connect the dots and be like, okay, he's used all these people because they're, one, controversial, but they all may have different perspectives. They're controversial because of something they did, but we may, as a society, not even just the hip-hop culture, we as a society may not necessarily take a step back and try to understand where they're coming from or why they did what they did. I mean, you can feel however you want to feel about it, but in general, when someone does something controversial, we don't necessarily go back and we're like, oh, why are they like this? We're more just immediately going to judge them, which is another thing that I'll get into shortly. Aside from him talking about perspectives, he talks a lot about the culture. The culture in this case, I'm going to assume to be just Black culture in general. You could limit it to hip-hop culture, but I feel like there's enough overlap and more, like, it veers more into just the community as a whole and how it's viewed by the larger community, like American society, maybe beyond that, but I'm going to limit it to that for right now. So you have, like I said, all these controversial figures to some extent, and they're all Black men. Because they're all controversial, at one point or another, most of them, with the exception of Nipsey, I feel, have been canceled, or there's been attempts to cancel them. And if you think about it, to make it a race thing, honestly, is like you have all these Black people who have done something wrong, and we're so quick to judge them for it. Whereas if you switch places and it was someone who was white, they'd be more, like, there's more chance for forgiveness for them, it feels. like our society is so quick to be like, oh no, this person that's already thought of as lesser did something bad. They're just bad people. So that could be what he's going for, and why he chose these people, aside from the references to these people. But I don't know. I mean, that might be a bit of a stretch. Going back to the culture bit, in the first verse, he's rapping from either his perspective or from the perspective of someone in his generation or from his neighborhood. And he starts off by saying, I come from a generation of pain where murder is minor. By saying this, we're essentially saying, like, murder is so common for his generation that pain is nothing. They become desensitized to it. And the reason for this murder is essentially clout chasing. Like, you could even go back and be like, hey, all these figures that he's used are people that young kids may have looked up to. And because they looked up to them, they want to, at least emulate them to some extent. And by emulating them, they're gonna just take their appearance essentially. And they've got money, so they've got nice things. All these kids want nice things, and so they're trying to chase clout. They want to appear like these other people. And by appearing like these other people, I mean, people get jealous. Others in the community, or just not even, either in your neighborhood or another neighborhood, people are going to be jealous. Like, oh, why you got this? And, you can make a wrong turn eventually because you're so stuck on this, like, oh, I need to have all these things, that you may get killed for it. Obviously, there's other reasons for violence and murder, but that's one thing that's come up recently. Another thing that he mentions through that verse is how people just get shot for doing nothing. Like, dude he just got out of jail. He just left the halfway house. He was just trying to buy some weed and he got killed. It's like, even if you're not trying to be like clout chasing or anything, like you're not safe. And I mean, I guess you could also make it be like, oh, clout chasing because you killed somebody. Like, yeah, maybe. But anyways, there's a whole lot with that on its own. With the second verse, that's when we start to see him use the deepfakes and acknowledge these other people. The first face he used was O.J. Simpson. And honestly, I don't think there was much of a connection there other than him making a Jay-Z reference and Jay-Z having the Story of OJ song. Beyond that, I'm not too sure. When he brings in Kanye, though, that does make sense because he says bipolar, or his friend's bipolar. So, we are all aware that Kanye is bipolar. As you go through the rest of that verse, he switches to Jussie Smollett. And when he does that, it's hard to pinpoint exactly why. But in my mind, the way I thought of it, at least, like the reason that he brought up Jussie Smollett is because, one, the controversy behind him is that he got attacked. So people are like, oh no, he just faked it. But you could maybe take a step forward, or like step back and be like, okay, well, why did he do that in the first place? Like, yeah, you could attribute it to attention seeking, but you could also be like, well, this is a gay black man, and he's just trying to say like, oh, these are the attacks that happen to black people and gay people, and both gay black people at any time. So, I mean, feel however you want to feel. I'm not trying to defend anyone either way. I'm just trying to take the perspectives. The other thing that he really mentions that was interesting and also perspective to an extent was when he mentioned that he was in Argentina and performing at Lollapalooza, and he announced to the crowd that Nipsey Hussle had passed away, which he then says history repeats again, which was very reminiscent of when Nas announced that Tupac had passed away. And then if you know Kendrick and Tupac's relationship or their connection, that makes sense because going back to Pimp a Butterfly, he did the whole back and forth interview with Tupac, but he also has had in the past dreams of Tupac, like just talking to him. So, there's a relationship there. You could also go even further and be like, oh, well, because a lot of people do this. And I think J. Cole said it on Interlude, but Christ died at 33, so did Pimp C and so did Nipsey. Like, he's maybe connecting it even further. History repeating itself back when Christ was crucified. Like, we are, like, nothing's changed. People are still dying for whatever, essentially. That's also probably a lot of, like, a huge stretch, but who knows? It's Kendrick. As we get to the end of that verse, he then switches to Will Smith and says, and ends the verse saying, in a land where hurt people hurt more people, fuck calling it culture. So, hurt people. It's something that people say all the time, and I feel like it's pretty true. But we don't necessarily address why or like how to approach it or how to fix it. Like, we just kind of say that and keep it pushing, especially when it's for black people. Like, yeah, there were so many people who came out and were just making memes of Will Smith. I don't blame you. Like, it was a wild thing to see. But if you try to take a step back, you're like, okay, well, why did he do that? Like, was it just a bunch of built up and pent up anger? Or was it something else entirely? Like, we don't necessarily try to look at the perspective of it. But, like, that honestly could be attributed to anything. Because even though he used Will Smith as an example here, you could take it back to the first verse where he's in the neighborhood and people are killing others for whatever they have on them because they're jealous, because they're hurt in some way. They're like, envy is a big deal. Like, if you're envious of somebody, you already have ill feelings towards them, and those ill feelings can manifest into wanting to kill them. There's steps in between, obviously, but it leads to that. And then with the final verse, he first uses Kobe's face, which is intense because he starts rapping about how he's done all these things and what he's going to do next. And then, life gets cut short. It's almost like this third verse is a direct response to the first one and the second one to an extent. More so the first one, because the first one is straight up talking about murder and people dying for whatever reason. Kobe's death was wild. And it's not necessarily murder in the sense that it was intentional. Like, it did happen, and yeah, there's details there, but it was a death that happened. But then as you go through, you get to the point where he's speaking from Nipsey's perspective. And that was very interesting as well, to be honest. Like, there's so many things you can pull from it, because the way that he's portraying Nipsey is a very forgiving and almost holy figure. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In my mind, that's always how I've seen Nipsey. Like, yeah, he can get wild. Like, we all saw him slap that dude. But he's, in general, like, when you hear him speak, he's very worldly. And it comes across pretty well. So for him to be rapping from the perspective of Nipsey when he's getting shot and getting killed by the man who killed him, like, it's very interesting. Like, Nipsey's like, yo, I understand. I forgive you. Like, you may not be forgiven wherever you end up after this, but I forgive you. It's wild to think about. And it feels appropriate, but again, like, other people may have differing opinions. Like, people may have thought that Nipsey wouldn't necessarily say that. But by him forgiving him, it's almost Christ-like to an extent. He's like forgiving. Like, he understands this person's perspective, which is essentially what I feel Kendrick has been trying to get across throughout this whole track. Like, the understanding others' perspectives and also understanding how it connects to the culture. Like, people do things because they need to sometimes. Like, it may not be something that they want to do, like in the case of Nipsey. Like, dude may not have really wanted to do that, but he had to for one reason or another. But, and now he has to deal with the consequences. But we, as people, are generally going to lean towards the negative part. Like, oh, he just did this because he didn't like Nipsey, or like just something that's more, I guess, negative in total nature. Like, we're not going to try to understand their perspective. I'm not trying to say that what he did was right, because obviously killing people is not the right thing to do in general. So, but like, you have to understand like why he did that. You don't have to, but I think it's appropriate and necessary to an extent to understand why he did that. Like, yeah, at the end of the day, he killed somebody, but why? Like, that's a whole nother conversation. And then connecting it to the culture. What I also wanted to just bring up, because it was very important, I felt, was the way that he ends the verse as Nipsey, where he's talking to his brother Sam and tells him like, yo, make sure that my kids watch all my interviews and make sure that you live all the dreams that we produce. Like, he's not necessarily speaking just about his children, but the youth, the next generation. Because a lot of the things that Nipsey said, he was wise beyond years. Let's put it like that. Like, he has a lot of knowledge, and if things didn't go this way, he probably would have changed some stuff. He would have, yeah, I don't know. But I think he's talking about just the future generations. And again, this is more Kendrick's spin on it. I feel like Nipsey would want that to an extent, which is why he would say the things he says during the interviews and in his music. But Kendrick is like, no, like, this needs to happen. Like, we have to push that forward, because Nipsey was one of those people who had a lot to say, and his teachings were important. And I just realized that it keeps coming back to like a more holy figure. Not saying that Nipsey is a holy figure, but you can think that's just the image that he portrayed. Anyways, at the end of all this, if you've made it this far, the whole purpose, I feel, of the song, or at least the thing that I wanted to take away, is that there's a lot of perspectives out there. And when it comes to prominent figures in any culture, but more specifically Black culture, these figures need to, like, they feel like they need to hold themselves to a different standard. Like, they have to try way harder to be perceived as good, essentially. Whereas if you look at their counterparts, they can get away with a little bit more. That's not something that is going to change overnight, of course, but it's something that we can address. And going beyond that, like, yeah, sure, like, however you may feel about any of these people in here, like, and what they have done, you have to also think about, like, where they're coming from. I mean, you don't have to, of course, but I feel like it is important to understand where people are coming from, because that way conversation is built and communities are able to move forward. Like, there's just so much to it. And then the other thing that he really brought up was culture. Really, both those things go hand in hand, but the culture aspect is just the culture that everyone sees. Like, everyone, like, just society in general, it's so easy to see Black culture and see what's going on and pick at it and be like, oh yeah, we're going to support them when they're doing things that we like and we appreciate and that we can put our own spin on. But anytime something goes wild, we don't really want to support them, or we just think of them as lesser because they did something wrong. Again, I could just be pulling from who knows where, but I feel like these are things that he wanted to bring up, or at least that's what I took away from it. But that's where I'll end that. I've talked for 20-something minutes straight. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of the song and what you may have pulled from it, because honestly, there was a lot to it, and like, I know a lot of people don't listen to the Heart regularly, but this time it feels a little different. I don't know how this is going to play into the album. I probably should have mentioned that at some point, but we'll just have to wait and see. But yeah, let me know what y'all thought of the song. Let me know how you feel about the concepts that I brought up, if they're pulling from thin air or if there's some validity to it. Also, like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Thank you for watching, and please stay safe out there.